All right, folks, I'm going to get started. The projector's not working yet. Somebody's coming to work on it, so I'll just get started. And then, ideally, when I'm going to start presenting the material, that you'll be available. I mean, the projector will be working. Anyway, welcome, everybody. Welcome to the 11th week of school. We've got a week left before the second exam, which is going to be a week from today. So make sure that A, you recognize that is happening, and B, that you are giving yourself enough time to prepare for it, that you're going to come in here and do the best job possible, because that's what I need you to do. So today we're going to cover chapter 12, Perfect Competition. So we've covered in the second half of the course, including this one, it'll be 4 chapters. The first chapter was chapter 9, 10, 11, 12. Yes, it was 9. 9 sort of got us walking on this journey of using this very specific approach that we use in economics to study decision making, which is marginal analysis, and that kind of laid the theoretical foundations for what's the nature of the approach and how we go about answering questions with that approach. So make sure you understand that in the most general terms in the way that it was presented in chapter 9. And then again in chapter 10, we moved into the rational consumer choice model that basically had us study the decisions of consumers to consume, given that they have a limited amount of money available to them. They have a budget that they face, which is ultimately what we all face. And there are prices to things that they want to buy. And so we use marginal analysis in that chapter to identify the optimal point of consumption for a consumer, which is their consumption bundle, which is made up of all the goods that they prefer to buy and give them the most amount of satisfaction per dollar spent at that point where they have chosen and decided on what they want to purchase, their optimal consumption bundle. So make sure you understand that whole chapter, both the main part of the chapter and the appendix being the main model that you should understand. I've already talked to you about what it is about that model that you should understand and the things that you should be able to identify given changing conditions that I might give you that you might need to explore within that model. So make sure you understand that and are able to do that. And then we jumped into the last chapter, which had to do with production and costs. So on the chapter that has to do with production and costs, that got us started on this road of analyzing the optimal decisions, the best decisions that firms can make, the producers in the economy, with respect to how much they're going to charge people for the goods they produce, how much they should produce given the nature of the markets that they operate in. And then how much profit they could wind up making in those type of situations. So we, in that chapter, established a very general sort of model of production in which we talked about both the short run and the long run. The short run being defined as a time period in which at least one input into production is fixed. And so that made a big difference, because ultimately what all of that was for was to establish the nature of the costs that firms face when they're making their decisions. And that's what we base all of our analysis on, which is the costs that folks face versus the benefits. And so we got very specific about production, and then that gave us very specific information and intuition about the costs that they face, both in the short run and the long run. So we went through that. We established the various costs, first in the total cost realm, where we just kind of looked at the overall cost of producing, which were a function of their fixed cost and the variable cost. And then that helped us to establish one of the most important costs that we will be considering, which is the marginal cost, the extra cost of producing additional units, which is the first component we need to be able to then use marginal analysis to study the best way that firms go about producing. The next thing they need to consider aside from their marginal cost, is their marginal benefit, the extra benefit they gain from selling additional units, and that's the price that they can charge. So that's what we're going to start talking about today in a very specific market setting. Once we got the marginal cost stuff down, then we went to averages. So you, again, have to make sure that you are able to jump back and forth from totals to averages, being able to understand what the distinction is between all the costs, and then, of course, being able to understand the importance of marginal versus average cost. So we established that the costs that firms incur to produce, if you divide them by quantity, that gets you to the average cost of production. And that is also going to be broken down into the average variable cost and the average fixed cost that it takes to produce an individual unit. So the average cost tells you at any given level how much on average does it cost me to produce this amount. And so what we're going to start doing today is start taking that framework and applying it to a very specific market setting, which is the most competitive market setting that a firm can operate in. We call it perfect competition, so it's a perfectly competitive market. And in those markets, the firms don't have a lot of ability to set their prices because it's as competitive as it can possibly be. There's so many producers that nobody really has any ability to have any leverage over the markets and say, well, my version of what I'm selling is different than other people's version, so I can charge a different price. Like that, nobody has the power in this type of market. So that's basically what we'll study this week, is like the decision making by firms in this very specific type of market setting, the perfectly competitive market. And then that'll finish off the second part of the course. You'll take your exam. We'll come back next Tuesday, and we will start talking about the other side of the competitive spectrum, which is the monopoly setting, where there's only one firm and other firms aren't able to compete with that one firm. They aren't able to get into the market. And that completely changes the nature of the decisions that firms make, because if you're not competing with anybody, that pretty much gives you free reign to do whatever you want. And so monopolists wind up having a lot of power. And so we'll talk about the issues associated with that. We'll look at how they end up making their decisions, and in comparison to firms that are going to be presented today in a perfectly competitive market. And just kind of highlight the stark differences between these extreme ends of the competitive spectrum that firms may find themselves in, depending on what kind of good they're interested in selling, and ultimately what kind of market that leads them to. And then beyond that, we're going to look at the in-between cases, which wind up being more complicated than the extreme cases, because the more in-between cases are the more common ones, the ones that most firms find themselves in. And generally what you're going to find in those type of markets is either a lot of competition, but still some ability to kind of have a little bit of ability to kind of raise prices above what other people are selling, and those are called monopolistically competitive markets, where like everybody kind of sells a different version of the same thing, but anybody could really sell anything in those markets. So if you think about like the hamburger market, there's firms that sell, obviously McDonald's sells their Big Mac, Burger King sells their Whopper. They're all selling burgers, but through advertising, they're able to create the idea that what they're selling is not exactly a burger, it's their own version of a burger, which then allows them to have a little bit of that power that monopolists have, nowhere near as much as a monopolist, but definitely more power to set prices than you get in perfectly competitive markets, which again is the one we're going to look at today if the projector is ever going to come on. But the other possible situation you could have is what's called an oligopoly, in which there are a lot of firms I'm sorry, there aren't a lot of firms. There's a small amount of large firms, and they dominate the market. What did you press there?
Muted.
Mute?
Yeah.
That's strange. Why would the screen turn off if it's muted?
It's an image mute, so it's
That's weird.
audio visual.
It's nice. It's good to know.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. All right, problem solved. Mute. It just says mute. It doesn't say audio visual. It says volume and it says mute. But we're back, folks. We're back in action. We never left, but fortunately. Anyway, so that final setting, the oligopoly setting, there's a few large firms that dominate the market, and that's most markets that you're going to find. And the thing about those markets is the firms can or want to work together and benefit from the market the way a monopolist would. If there's only a few firms, if they work together, they're basically working as one firm, and therefore they can get as much profit as a monopolist is able to get. But there's laws against that. So they can't do it explicitly, and so that creates a challenge for them, of course. What also creates a challenge is that because they share the market, the decisions they make are not just based on their own costs and the benefits they gain from the market, but also on what their rivals are going to do. What's their competition going to do in response to what they do? And that further complicates the decision making in those settings, which requires more analysis, different types of models to try to kind of help to maneuver those decisions. And so we'll lightly touch upon that complexity here, but we present more of the complex sort of approaches to dealing with those markets by those firms, the oligopolists, in more advanced courses. But certainly we'll introduce it here, and we'll start to talk about the issues that relate to that market setting. And then again, we're going to have a couple of last chapters that'll kind of take us in a couple other directions, but ultimately it will all kind of tie together, and the course will be done. So you're on the way to being done. That's a good thing. But we're not done yet, and you've got a lot to do between now and then. So you got to keep your head in the game. You got to be focused. Don't take any opportunity to just like slack off and do other things. Focus on what you're doing here for the next we have roughly 5 weeks left. Stay in this. Don't just put things off. Don't just try to sort of have moments where you can just kind of let go of the stress and forget about what you're doing here. This is not the time for that. This is a time to really be all in, to just kind of push through the pain of having to just give up, these other things that you want to do. Push through that, put in as much time as possible into these next 5 weeks, both so that you can do well in this class and your other classes, and then you'll feel really great about what you've done here. You'll walk into the summer feeling just accomplished, without regret. You'll really enjoy that time, and you will deserve the enjoyment of that time. But again, we're not there yet. We're going to get there, and just always keep that in mind as you're pushing yourself these next few weeks. But again, this is definitely not the time for you to take your foot off the gas. This is the time to really just be all in, full throttle, and just take this whole thing down. So make sure you do that. So again, today we're going to cover chapter 12, part of it, finish it on Thursday, and then we'll have our second exam next Tuesday. Are there any questions you want me to address before I jump into the material? All right, great. So we're going to talk about perfect competition, and then we'll talk about production and profits in the perfectly competitive industry, and then we'll talk about how we can get to the industry supply curve, the supply curve that you've come to know in the first part of the course. We'll talk about how we can get from the decisions that individual firms make to that industry supply curve. All right, so perfect competition. So a producer in a perfectly competitive market is what's called a price taker. And that means that its actions cannot affect the market price of the good or service it sells. Everybody sells the same thing. It doesn't matter if you choose to sell 100,000 units of something. Let's say we're talking about apples. You choose to sell just very general apples. You can't do anything special with apples. Apples are apples. You're selling 100,000. I'm selling 100. Regardless of the fact that you're selling 100 times more than I am, I'm sorry, 1,000 times more than I am, then that doesn't mean that you have any more ability to affect the market than I have to affect the market, because even though you're a big competitor against me, both of us are competing against who knows how many other firms, a lot of other firms, enough so that you can't affect the price of the market based on the amount that you're willing to sell, and neither can I. We have to simply take the price as given. We are price takers in perfectly competitive markets. The same goes for consumers in perfectly competitive markets. Even if there's a buyer of the apples that's like enormous, they buy like 100,000 apples whenever they buy apples for whatever reason. Maybe they're buying for schools or something. I don't know. And you're just buying a few apples a week. Neither of you, regardless, can have any effect on the overall price of the market because there's millions of apples being transacted in the apple market. And so even though you might be buying a large amount of apples, you still can't like say, well, I'm buying a lot of apples, you should give me a better deal. Because the sellers know that if you don't buy the apples, somebody else will, because there's enough demand there that nobody can affect the price on either side of the market. Both sides are price takers. All right, so let's define the perfectly competitive market formally. Again, the extreme end of the competitive spectrum, where the market is as competitive as possible. The firms that operate in them are competing against too many other firms. So in a perfectly competitive market, all market participants, both consumers and producers, are price takers, as I've already mentioned. The supply and demand model, which we introduced in Chapter 3 and have used repeatedly since then, is a model of a perfectly competitive market. So we can reveal that now to be a perfectly competitive market. That model itself does not give us like direct insights into markets where you don't have perfect competition, where you have a monopoly or a monopolistically competitive market or an oligopoly. In those situations, the firms that supply, they have a supply, we'll talk about it when we get there, but like they don't have an actual supply curve because they don't have a decision on how much they're going to sell based on the price. They make a decision based on what's called marginal revenue, the extra revenue they gain from selling additional units, which is going to be less than the price for them, but it's actually going to be exactly equal to the price for perfectly competitive firms, which then allows us to then have a supply curve for these. Don't worry, I'm going to be very specific and clear about everything I'm talking about right now. But anyway, when the market is as competitive as possible, we can represent the market with a supply and demand curve as you have been introduced to early on in this course. But you should understand now that that does not represent all markets, but the insights you can gain from it can give you an idea of how most markets can operate. So an industry in which producers are price takers are called perfectly competitive industries. All right, so there's two necessary conditions for perfect competition. The first is for an industry to be perfectly competitive, it must contain many producers, none of whom have a large market share. So nobody has a huge slice of the pie, of the overall sort of pie that is, the amount that all firms can sell in a market, the overall revenues that can be transacted in a market. Every firm sells a piece of that. But again, nobody has a big piece of it, and therefore nobody has any ability to affect the price. Everybody's a price taker. A producer's market share is the fraction of the total industry output that they produce out of the total available. So, if let's say there's $1 million worth of apples being sold, and you sell $100,000 worth of those apples, and you have a tenth of the market share. That's your market share, a tenth. All right, the second condition for perfect competition is that for an industry to be perfectly competitive is that if only consumers regard the products of all producers as equivalent. The thing that's being sold is the same. Like you cannot, like I said, make your special version of this. I can't make a special type of apple that's going to be, orange and, make it different than the other ones. It's all the same. Everybody's selling the exact same thing, and therefore it's a standardized product, a product that consumers regard as the same good, even when it comes from different producers, and it's sometimes known as a commodity. So the things that are usually fall into this category, aside from like agricultural products, is like the raw materials that firms use to produce, like iron ore, the oil that's eventually turned into gasoline that's just directly pumped out of the ground, any kind of metals that are mined out of the ground. Anything that's just like a raw material is, again, something that's very general. We call them commodities. And nobody, again, can take it and say, here's my special version of it. I can charge a higher price. Everybody just basically sells the same thing, a standardized product. So that is a second condition. No firm has any big market share is the first condition. The second is that everything that's being sold is the same as a standardized product. Now, a really important characteristic of these industries is that there is free entry and exit into these industries. Firms can easily enter these industries in the long run if they want to. Like if there's profits being made, then investors from outside the industry will set up shop and they will start competing in these industries. Nothing is stopping them from doing so. You'll see that this is different when we get to the other market settings, especially in monopoly. Monopoly is the worst case scenario where there are what are called barriers to entry, which stop firms from getting into the industry. In a monopoly, there is no free entry and exit. And that's what allows the one firm to kind of dominate and basically be the industry. Whereas in perfect competition, everybody's selling the same thing. If there's profits being made, firms will just, again, set up shop and start competing because they want to get a hold of those profits, and there will be nothing standing in their way. So when there are no obstacles to entry into or exit from an industry, we say there's free entry and exit. So we talked about last time Selena's salsa example where she could have a certain amount of fixed costs and that'll put her on a average total cost path. But as her average cost goes up, she may want to increase the amount of her capital. So she might invest more into her fixed costs, which will get her on a new average total cost curve. And the only way to do that is to be in the long run. In the long run is when all the inputs are variable and firms are able to buy everything they need. Another thing that they can do in the long run is to get rid of the things that they don't need. So we also saw a situation where she was on an average total cost curve corresponding to a certain level of capital that she'd purchased, and she wound up producing a lot less than she thought she would need to, which means that her average cost of producing was higher because she had extra capital she had to pay for. So she unloaded that and got on another average total cost curve with lower fixed costs. And in order for her to do that, she had to be in the long run. So another thing she could have done was to just exit the industry. But again, in the short run, not all inputs are variable. So like if we're talking about somebody's farmland or somebody's machinery or somebody's factory, they're likely locked into a lease or something that's keeping them within the business. So even if they're making losses in the short run, they have to stay in the industry until they can get out of these leases and get out of the contracts and eventually exit the industry. So that's why we say there's free entry and exit, but it happens in the long run, not just at any time. All right, production and profits. All right, so we're going to consider an example. Noelle, she runs a Christmas tree farm. So the Christmas tree market is a perfectly competitive market. Everybody's selling the same thing. We're going to suppose that the market price of Christmas trees is $18. So there's a demand, there's a supply in the entire market that represents all buyers and all sellers. They intersect at some point, which corresponds to the equilibrium price and quantity. And the price happens to be $18 in this perfectly competitive market. So here's the downward sloping demand. There's the upward sloping supply. There's the $18 that's being established as the equilibrium price in the Christmas tree industry. And there's some quantity that's being transacted in equilibrium in this market. So remember, now we're using marginal analysis, so we're studying the decisions of individual firms. When we're studying the decisions of individual firms, we need to view the perspective of this market from the individual firm. So the individual firm has a perspective on this market. So this would be the perspective of the market. They have, of course, a price and a quantity. They're trying to set a price and they're trying to figure out how much they're going to sell their goods for. So this is the market from the perspective of the individual supplier. The individual supplier in a perfectly competitive industry is a price taker. So again, they can't affect this price over here. Whatever Noelle decides to do, she can't not shift the supply curve and maybe lower the equilibrium price in the market. She can't do anything. All she can do is sell at the $18 price, however much she wants to sell, which will ultimately be dictated by her costs as well. So from her perspective, the $18 is going to represent the demand curve for her. It's the price at which she is able to supply as much as possible, but she cannot affect it. So it's a perfectly elastic supply curve that the individual perfectly competitive firm faces. Perfectly elastic being as elastic as possible, as sensitive as possible to price changes. Because everybody's a price taker, they can't affect the price. If Noelle tried to raise her price by even a penny, everyone would jump ship and go to the next Christmas tree seller that's selling their trees for $18 because everybody else is selling them for $18. And there's enough sellers to go around that everybody knows that they can buy the tree for $18 anywhere else. And so if Noelle tries to raise the price by even a penny, quantity demanded goes down to zero. Consumers in perfectly competitive markets are as sensitive as possible to price changes with respect to an individual firm. And so that's, again, why we have this flat demand curve that basically represents the perspective of an individual firm on the market. Again, they can't affect the price, so this is their demand curve, but they could sell as much as they want at $18. And so that's why it's flat here. The amount that they sell has no effect on the price. All right, so the point of obviously all firms is to make profits, right? So this is just an example of what the benefits and the costs look like overall for Noelle. At zero quantities, she's got a total cost of $140. So she's not producing anything, but she's got $140 in total cost. Why is that? What is that $140? What do we call that in terms of our fixed cost, right? It's the cost of the fixed input, right? Regardless of whether or not there's something being produced, there is still a fixed cost. The cost, the overhead cost, the cost of setting up shop, the cost of having a factory, the cost of having a farmland, the cost of having your machines, etc. So she's got a total cost. Even if she doesn't sell anything, not selling anything means she doesn't have any revenue. Revenue is the price times the quantity sold. So obviously zero sold means zero revenue. So the profit is the difference between her total cost and her total revenue. Obviously it's going to be negative 140. Not a good situation. She wants to make some money. That's why she's in business. So obviously she starts producing. Maybe she produces 10 trees and they're selling for $18 each. So total revenue is equal to 10 times 18, 180. Her total cost of production goes up because her variable costs go up. In order to produce trees, she has to pay people to help her produce those trees. So she does. In this case, we're looking at $160 in variable costs, $140 in fixed costs. So that's $300 in total cost. Total revenue is 180. So she's still at a negative profit. She should continue to produce. So she does at 20 trees. Her revenues go up to 360. Her total cost is 360, and her profit is at zero. And remember, we're talking about economic profit here. Economic profit is total revenue minus both explicit and implicit costs. So it's not like accounting profit where you just subtract costs, like the explicit costs from revenues, and you have some positive amount. You also take into account like what you're passing up by investing your money to produce. So the money that's being spent to pay for the fixed cost and the variable cost, that money could have been put into a bank account or put into the markets and gotten some basic return. And so because that's not happening, that's part of the implicit cost. And so if somebody's making zero economic profits, we're subtracting that implicit cost as well, meaning that if we were to look at accounting profit and not subtract that implicit cost, there would be a positive accounting profit there. So when we're saying that there's zero economic profit, there's positive accounting profit. At least the next best option is being in terms of like what that financial capital could get a person that's maybe running a small firm. They're at least earning that much. They're at least earning what they would earn if they just invested it in like some basic market instruments that can give them some kind of return. But still, obviously, firms want to make more than zero economic profit. And so we see that as we move down, her profits do increase up until the point where she's producing and selling 50 trees. At that point, she's making $180 in profit. But we see that after that, her profits start to go down. And that, of course, has to do with the fact that there's diminishing returns to the labor input that causes total cost to increase at an increasing rate. Marginal cost is increasing as you produce more and more because there's diminishing returns in the short run to labor. And so that is what will ultimately, even though her revenues will increase, it will increase her cost so much that her profits will actually start to go down. So there is a point at which it is optimal for her to produce, and it is the point at which her profits are at their maximum. Now we can gain more insight into the profit maximizing choice of output by viewing it as a problem of marginal analysis. So that's what we'll do now. So we're going to use marginal analysis to choose the profit maximizing quantity of output. So remember from chapter 9 that the profit maximizing principle of marginal analysis states that the optimal amount of an activity is the level at which the marginal benefit is equal to the marginal cost. And we're talking about a business, their marginal benefit is going to be their marginal revenue, the additional revenue generated by selling one more unit of output. And we've already looked at marginal cost. Again, that's something that we established in the last chapter, the difference in total cost over the difference in quantity, which if you reduce it down tells you the additional cost of selling an additional unit or producing an additional unit. All right, so the general formula for marginal revenue is the same as any marginal anything that we've looked at. In this case, it's going to be the change in total revenue generated by one additional unit of output. So it's the change in total revenue divided by the change in the quantity of output, the marginal revenue. Or, of course, mathematically, we could represent it as change. The triangle represents change. Change in total revenue over change in quantity will give us marginal revenue. All right, so this is the producer's optimal output rule. Profit is going to be maximized by producing the quantity at which the marginal revenue of the last unit produced is equal to marginal cost. So that's just the general case regardless of what kind of market a firm is operating in. And again, we're talking about a very specific marketplace here, the perfectly competitive marketplace, which is at one end of the competitive spectrum, the other end is monopoly, and the in-between cases are monopolistically competitive markets and oligopolies. So this rule will apply to all of them. Now, the thing that's different, though, about this setting is that for a perfectly competitive market where everybody's a price taker, nobody can affect the price, and they can sell as much as they want at the price given their costs, that the extra revenue gain from selling additional units is going to be equal to the price. Because, again, they just are able to move along that flat, perfectly elastic demand curve and say, well, I want to produce this much, I want to produce 80 versus 40. So they do. So they sell 80 more units. And then the extra revenue they gain is going to be the change in the total revenue divided by the change in the number of units sold, which is going to be equal to the price. So the marginal revenue for a perfectly competitive firm is going to be equal to the price. That's not going to be the case in all other market settings. In all other market settings, the marginal revenue will be less than the price. And that's why it's important to emphasize here the distinction. And it's important to understand that this rule is being set up for a very specific reason, not just for the sake of, just presenting random information to you. All right, so here we have a table where we can analyze the optimal decision for Noel by looking at marginal revenue and marginal cost and comparing them. Again, profit is maximized by producing the quantity at which the marginal revenue of the last unit produced is equal to its marginal cost. So again, 0 units, total cost equal to 140. 10 units, total cost equal to 300. So therefore, the marginal cost is going to be the change in total cost over the change in quantity. The change in total cost is 160. The change in quantity is equal to 10. So the marginal cost is equal to $16. The marginal revenue of the extra trees, though, is only equal to $18 because, again, 10 trees and they're each being sold at $18, so that's $180. So the change in revenue is $180. The change in quantity is 10. 180 divided by 10 gets you to 18. Marginal revenue equals price for a perfectly competitive firm. So the marginal revenue is equal to $12. So therefore, it makes sense based on this information for Noel to produce 10 trees because the marginal revenue exceeds the marginal cost. So there's a net gain, which is the difference between the marginal revenue and the marginal cost of $2 to produce at that level. Working our way down the table, if we go to the next line for 20, we see total cost is $360. That means that the marginal cost of those 20 trees is going to be $18 each. I'm sorry, $6 each. And the marginal revenue is 18. So definitely marginal revenue exceeds marginal cost. It makes sense to produce 20. Going to 30, we see that the marginal cost of going to 30 is $8 per tree. And the marginal revenue, extra revenue gained, is 18. Marginal revenue outweighs marginal cost. It makes sense to produce 30 trees. The net gain is positive. So we see net gain is positive up until this point where we are at 50, which is the point that we identified in the earlier table when we weren't looking at marginal values, we were looking at total values that this firm would maximize their profits on. Looking at the marginal values, we see that going from 40 to 50, that the marginal cost of each tree is equal to 16. So we see that marginal cost first decreases and increases, which is ultimately what the pattern that we deemed like the most common. And that's why, like last class, towards the end, I said, remember to just focus on the marginal cost curve that's got the swoosh shape that looks like kind of like the Nike swoosh, where it goes down and then goes up. That is because there are initially increasing returns to labor. The first few people that are hired, they divide up the jobs. The firms benefit from specialization. And so each additional person is able to produce more than the last person. Initially, that's what increasing returns means, which means that the additional cost of producing additional units goes down initially. But because the firms are in the short run, they're limited by the amount of capital, by the amount of factory space, by the amount of machines they have. Then as they hire more and more people to produce more things, those people are able to produce, but it starts to become inefficient. They start to get in each other's way because there's not enough room in the factory. There's not enough machines to work with. And so you have diminishing returns, right? Each additional person produces a positive amount, but less than the last person, which means that the cost of producing additional units starts to go up, which is why marginal cost starts to increase here. So we see that it decreased and then increased. And again, that's because of increasing returns to labor and then decreasing returns to labor due to the short run limitation. All right, so we see that marginal cost went down and started to go up, but still, like from 30 to 40, marginal cost was less than marginal revenue, so she kept going. And then going from 40 to 50, we see that marginal cost again goes up, but it's still less than marginal revenue, so she kept going, produced 50 trees. Then she did her analysis and said, well, it makes sense for me to continue on past that point. She looked at the marginal cost of producing those additional 10 trees that would get her to 60. She saw that on average that they would cost 20 in marginal cost. And we see that marginal revenue, of course, remains the same. Marginal revenue is constant for the perfectly competitive market because, again, the extra revenue they gain is the price that they can sell things at. So that's constant. So therefore, going from 50 to 60, marginal cost would exceed marginal revenue, which means that it wouldn't be worth it to her to produce at that level. So she stopped at 50. She stops at the last point where marginal cost is less than marginal revenue. So the marginal benefit outweighs the marginal cost. That's the last time at a level of 50 trees where, again, her net gain is positive. Beyond that, her net gain becomes negative. So this is a general pattern you'll see with most firms as far as like their production. And when we're talking about a perfectly competitive market, this is what they're looking at to try to figure out how much they should produce. They're looking at their marginal cost and how that's changing and how that relates to the marginal revenue, the price. All right, now let's look at this graphically. So here's our swoosh-shaped marginal cost curve, the marginal cost curve that, again, I've told you need to know. So again, here's quantity of trees, here's the price of of the tree, but we can also have the cost on here because we're looking at cost first, but we're going to throw in our marginal revenue curve, which represents price as well. So we're going to have a few different curves here. So that's why our vertical axis has different terms there to identify the different scales. All right, so remember, there is a market, supply and demand over here. It's setting the price at $18. From the individual firm's perspective, the demand curve they face is this flat demand curve at the price, in this case, of $18. And that means that that is also the marginal revenue curve for the firm because, again, marginal revenue equals price, and it is constant. So this curve is the marginal revenue curve. Here's the marginal cost curve. So the price-taking firm's optimal output rule. So profit is maximized by producing the quantity of output at which the market price is equal to the marginal cost of the last unit produced. So any firm that operates in these type of markets where it's perfectly competitive, they're going to figure out how much they're willing to sell in these markets by looking at the comparison of the marginal cost that they face, which again, marginal cost, like the shape of the curve reflects their own production process, which then says something about their cost. So this is the information that they consider that reflects their internal conditions. And then the marginal revenue curve, the marginal benefit, ultimately, which is what they're looking at from that curve, is given from information from outside of the firm, what's happening in the industry. So the industry is dictating the benefit, and the nature of their production process is dictating the cost. And they choose the point of supply at the point where their marginal cost equals their marginal revenue. So again, here's, once again, just a reminder of where that marginal revenue equals price, which is our marginal revenue curve, where that came from, which is a perfectly elastic demand curve that the perfectly competitive market faces. It comes from just the perspective of the individual firm on the market. And that is equal to the marginal revenue curve. So then, therefore, the optimal point of production for, again, the perfectly competitive firm will happen at the point where the marginal cost equals the marginal revenue. Are there any questions about this? Alrighty. So then the question is, like, at the point where their marginal cost equals their marginal revenue, is the amount that they're selling at that point profitable for them? They need to figure out, is it profitable for them to even operate in the industry? Because they're going to operate in the industry at the level where their marginal cost equals their marginal revenue, meaning it equals their price. And so in this case, here's the marginal cost curve, here's the marginal revenue curve, and we've thrown in a third curve, the average total cost curve. If you remember from last week, the point at which marginal cost crosses average total cost, that's the point at which the average total cost curve is at its minimum. And so for this firm is operating at a point where they are not just selecting the optimal quantity based on their marginal cost and the marginal revenue, but it just happens to be that at that point, that average total cost also equals marginal cost, which means that average total cost is minimized. Remember, that's where a firm wants to be when they're producing. They want to be at the point where they are minimizing the average cost of producing, because it means for them that the cost of producing each unit is as low as it possibly can be. And so that's where the firm wants to operate. All right, so the firms, obviously, they want to maximize their profits. Now, the way that they measure profits is that they can look at the individual profit of an individual unit sold. So if you think about overall profits and you divide it by the quantity, that's going to give you the average profit. The average profit is going to be equal to the difference between the average revenue of selling a unit minus the average cost of selling a unit. So this is the average total cost here. The average revenue is total revenue divided by quantity. So the total amount that's being sold times the price divided by the total amount that's being sold, which is going to get you back to the price. So therefore, this average revenue here is equal to the price. So the profit of any unit is going to be the difference between the price that the firm can charge minus the average cost of producing that good. If the firm produces a quantity at which price is greater than the average total cost, then the firm is profitable. So let's say they were producing, so in this case, they cannot produce at any level where they will be profitable. The best they can do is to be at the point where they are making zero economic profit. Any other point that they produce at, the average cost of producing will be above the price and they will be operating at a loss. If the firm produces a quantity at which price equals average total cost, like we see here, the firm breaks even. They just break even again. They're at least making the money they would make if they weren't even producing and they were just investing the money in like some bonds or some kind of financial instrument that can give them some basic return in the market. If the firm produces a quantity at which price is less than the average total cost, the firm incurs a loss, where again, it would be at some points over here where the average total cost curve is above the price. All right, so here is an example where we see that the average total cost curve is below the perfectly elastic demand curve, which is the marginal revenue curve for the perfectly competitive firm. The perfectly competitive firm sets their optimal profit maximizing output level at the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So they're going to supply 50 trees. And we see that at 50 trees, the average cost of producing is less than the price they charge. So the average total cost of producing 50 units, in this case, is $14.40. So the first step for this firm was to figure out how much they should produce. And again, they figured that out based on the point where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. And now they're trying to figure out, is it profitable to produce at that level? They look at their average cost of producing at that level. That's what we did second here. It's $14.40. So the per unit profit is the difference between $18 and $14.40, which is $3.60. So each unit sold at that level will have a profit of $3.60. And if we multiply that by the amount that are being sold, which is 50, you've got $3.60 times 50, so that's going to be $180. So we can represent that amount of profit graphically as, again, the difference between the price being charged, the average total cost of producing at the optimal output level, times the quantity. So the area of this rectangle here that says profit in it represents the profits graphically. So that's how you can represent those profits graphically. You need to be familiar with these graphs and how they work because you will need to have that understanding for the exam. And ultimately, like if you have this stuff down, it's going to help you just have general intuition about how things work in business, whether or not you're going to go into business or not. You're going to have just like that basic understanding that, you know, you'll carry with you throughout your life, which will help you to just kind of deal with markets and whatnot. Anyway, so here is one example of how things could go for Noel, and it has everything to do with the average total cost curve, because again, that's going to dictate whether or not she's profitable. And so if, because of like, you know, her cost conditions, maybe she spent too much on fixed costs or maybe not enough, depending on that, like her average total cost curve will be somewhere else. And so that's going to dictate whether or not she's profitable or not. So here's another situation where the average total cost curve is above the price. So here we're assuming that the market price is equal to $10. So remember, the individual firms are price takers. They just accept the price being set in the market. But if you go back to what we talked about early on in the course, there are things in the market that will shift the supply and the demand curve. And when that happens, that will change the level of the equilibrium price, which will then change the level of the marginal revenue curve, which is also their perfectly elastic demand curve for a perfectly competitive firm. So depending on what's happening in the actual market to the left of this that we're not seeing, that's going to shift the curve. So even if the average total cost of producing remains the same, if let's say the the equilibrium price in the market went down because, let's say, that supply increased. Maybe it became cheaper for suppliers to supply, given that they are now maybe paying less to their workers. If that is the case, then that will lower the equilibrium price, which will lower the marginal revenue curve for the perfectly competitive firm, and therefore their optimal level of supply, the profit maximizing level of output, is going to happen at this point, where their marginal cost curve now equals the price, which corresponds to 30 trees. So now for Noelle now, she needs to supply 30 trees in order to make the most profit possible in this market. At that level, having established that level, again, at the point where marginal cost equals marginal revenue, which equals price, she has to figure out what's my average cost of producing. Well, to do that, you have to go up to the average total cost curve. In this case, the average total cost of producing 30 trees is equal to $14.67. Obviously, that's more than what she's collecting per unit. That's more than the marginal revenue. That's more than the price in the market. So now Noelle is operating at a loss. So the per unit loss is equal to, in this case, the difference between the price and the total cost in the average cost of producing, which is equal to $14.67. So she's losing $4.67 per unit she sells at the optimal amount. And then if you multiply the individual loss by the quantity that are being sold, in this case, which is 30, so it's negative $4.67 times 30 units, that's going to give us an approximate loss of profit of $140. So she's losing $140 in profits, which can be represented by this rectangle here, which is, again, the difference between the price and the average total cost of producing the optimal quantity, where marginal cost equals marginal revenue, times the quantity sold. So that's that rectangle there, which is something else you should be able to identify, whether there are profits or losses and what they look like on a graph. All right, so that's another way that it could go. So we see here that at the point that this firm is operating, that's the minimum average total cost. The lowest cost of producing on average happens at the point where marginal cost crosses the average total cost curve, and we see that she is operating at a level where that's not happening. So there's certain economies of scale, which we talked about at the end of the last class, that she's not taking advantage of, meaning she could get a little bit bigger and she could lower her average cost of producing, but given the cost conditions and the price that's being set in the market, she can't do that. So she's operating at a loss, and she's not minimizing her average cost of production. All right, so the minimum average total cost of a price-taking firm is called the break-even price. That's the point at which she would be breaking even, meaning, again, making at least that implicit cost, and she would be making zero economic profit. So we see that because the price is below the minimum average total cost, then she's not breaking even. In fact, she's making losses. All right, so given now what we understand about the different ways that the market result could go for these perfectly competitive firms, depending on where the marginal revenue curve is relative to the average cost of production, we can now sort of identify like what will be the short-run production decision for a firm, ultimately getting to the supply curve that will represent an individual firm's willingness to supply in a market. So here again, we've got our cost curves from the last chapter. Here's our swoosh-shaped marginal cost curve. There's our average total cost curve, U-shaped. Again, it's minimum at the point where marginal cost crosses it. And here is now the average variable cost curve, the average cost of each unit attributable to the variable input, which is labor. So like the average cost of producing a unit attributable to like the wages of workers, let's say. The minimum of the average variable cost curve also occurs when marginal cost crosses it. And the minimum of average total cost is to the right of the minimum of the average variable cost, because remember, average total cost is made up of both average fixed cost and average variable cost. So the fixed cost isn't changing as the firm gets bigger. You've got a number that's not changing divided by a number that's getting bigger. So your average fixed cost is always going down. So there's a spreading effect of the firm selling more that is essentially spreading out the average fixed cost of producing each unit, which is what is initially starting to pull down the average total cost curve. The other thing starting to pull down the average total cost curve is the the increasing returns that the firm faces initially from those first few workers that are hired, where again, the firm benefits from specialization. They divided the tasks, they produce more than the last person. And that's what's bringing down the average variable cost initially as well. Once diminishing returns hits this firm at the point where marginal cost starts to increase, the additional cost of producing is still less than both averages, so both curves are still being brought down. Average variable cost starts to be pulled up once marginal cost crosses it, but average total cost will still, for a bit, be decreasing. Even though you've got the average variable cost that starts to increase and starts to try to pull it up, the spreading effect of the average total cost is still dominant between this point and this point, which is still bringing down average total cost. At the point where marginal cost crosses it, that's the point where the diminishing returns effect starts to dominate, and the average variable cost that's increasing starts to pull up the average total cost, which is again what gives us the U-shaped average total cost curve. So it's just important. I need to repeat that story because it's important to understand there is a story behind why the curves look the way they do, and the story is an important one because it's the most common way that it can go for any company. And so if you understand the story, then you understand the curves, and you understand the costs, and you understand what they're doing. And if you understand that, then that's a big first step to really understanding how to just be a successful business person, or as just a consumer, understanding how businesses approach you. All right, so the short run production decision. All right, so here again are our cost firms, our cost curves for this firm. Here's the minimum average variable cost, again at the point where marginal cost crosses it. We're going to consider two cases, when the market price is below the minimum of the average variable cost, and then when the market price is greater than or equal to the minimum of the average variable cost. All right, so here's one possible scenario. Here again is the marginal revenue curve. There's our marginal cost curve that establishes the optimal amount of production for this firm, Q double star. At that amount, we see that average total cost is above the price, so the firm is making losses. And we see that the average variable cost curve, though, is below the price in this case. All right, so again, the firm is in the short run. The short run meaning that they cannot get rid of their fixed input. They cannot get out of their leases. They cannot sell their land. They need time. They realize we're making a loss. We need to get out of the market. But they can't because they're in the short run. In the long run, they can get out. There's free entry and exit in the long run. In the short run, they have to figure out, should we keep operating even though we're making a loss? All right, so the firm has two options here. One is it can shut down, collect no revenue, sell nothing, and simply pay their fixed costs. So remember, the difference between the average total cost and the average variable cost is the average fixed cost. So at any given level of output, you can look at the average fixed cost and then multiply it by quantity and get the total fixed cost. So in this case, the average fixed cost is the difference between this point and this point, right? The average total cost of the optimal quantity and the average variable cost of the optimal quantity. So that times the quantity will get us the fixed cost. Now the other option is to keep producing, collect revenue, and pay both the fixed and the variable costs that are covered by revenues. So the firm is making losses. They could shut down and have to pay their fixed costs, meaning continue to pay their lease, continue to pay whatever it is they're paying on these on their capital that, again, is keeping them in the short run until they can get out of their contracts or whatever, and then unload everything and get out of the industry. So they can either pay for those and do nothing else, or they can continue to operate, pay their workers, earn money from selling, and then pay some of their fixed costs in this case. So here's the total revenue that they earn. Price times quantity, represented by this amount here. This is their variable cost. So again, the difference between the average variable cost of producing times the quantity will give us the total variable cost, which represents the total amount that they're paying, like their variable input, which we assume is labor. So basically the wages that they're paying out. So that represents the wages. And we see that the total revenues are paying for their variable costs. And there's some left over. There's that green part there is the leftover revenues that they have available as they run their business to be able to pay some of their fixed costs. So that total revenue pays for part of the total fixed costs, which if they were to shut down would have to pay completely out of pocket. So if they continue operating, even though they're operating at a loss, because the average variable cost of producing at the optimal quantity is below the price, some of the revenues are covering some of the fixed costs, which means that the economic losses are less than they would be if they were to shut down. So in this short run situation, even though this firm is making losses, they should continue to operate because at least they're paying some of their fixed costs. So their economic losses are less than their total fixed costs. This is their total fixed cost, the difference between the average total cost and the average variable cost times the quantity. So if they were to shut down, they wouldn't earn any revenue, and they would have to pay for that, which is going to be greater than the amount that they have to pay for out of pocket if they continue operating. So again, even though this firm is making losses in the short run, they should continue to operate because the average variable cost curve is below the price. So you're going to need to be able to identify if a firm should continue operating or not in the short run, depending on what their cost conditions are. So you need to be able to understand everything that's happening here. So make sure that if you don't understand it at this moment, that you go back and kind of build up your understanding to it again, and then make sure it's all clear to you. All right, so again, if the average variable cost curve is less than the marginal revenue in the short run, the answer is don't shut down in this case, because if they shut down, then the amount that they have to pay out is going to be greater than the amount they have to pay out of pocket in losses by continuing to operate. All right, so here's the other possibility. So the other possibility is that they are making losses. So here again is their marginal cost. There's their marginal revenue. There's the optimal quantity. At the optimal quantity, average total cost is above the price, so they are making losses. But we see that the average variable cost curve is also above the price in this scenario. So here again are total revenues, price times quantity. And the total fixed cost, again, is the difference between the average total cost of producing at that level minus the average variable cost, which gives us the average fixed cost, times the quantity. So this gives us the total fixed cost. So we see that if they continue to operate in this situation, that not only will they have to pay their total fixed cost, but some of their variable costs are also not being covered by the revenue that they are collecting in the market. Again, this is what they're earning in the market, and their average variable cost, the average cost per unit attributable to their labor, is above the price, and so the revenues won't even cover the wages they're paying their employees. So if they continue operating, they not only have to pay their fixed costs, they also have to pay out of pocket some of the wages for the employees. So the economic losses are greater than their total fixed costs. So if the average variable cost is greater than the marginal revenue equals price in the short run, then the firm should shut down in that case. Because if they shut down, they would only have to pay for their total fixed costs. That's all that they would have to pay for. Continue paying their lease on the machines. Continue paying, whatever it is that they're paying that is keeping them locked into their capital, that is keeping them in the short run, not allowing them to get out of the industry. They would only have to pay for that, versus if they continue operating, their economic losses would be greater than that because they'd have to pay some of the wages out of pocket. So a firm will cease production in the short run if the market price falls below the shutdown price, which is equal to the minimum of the average variable cost curve. So the minimum of the average variable cost curve is known as the shutdown price. So if the price falls below the minimum of the average variable cost curve, the firm should shut down. Remember, the minimum of the average total cost curve is known as the break-even price. If the price is below that, that means they're making economic losses. The minimum of the average variable cost curve is the shutdown price. It's the price where the firm should shut down, even in the short run, if they're making losses. But if the price is above the shutdown price, they should continue to operate even if they're making losses. So it's worth noting that the decision to produce when the firm is covering its variable costs but not all of its fixed costs is similar to the decision to ignore sunk costs. So remember, sunk costs are costs that should be ignored. There's no sense crying over spilled milk. We talked about this in chapter 9. So the decision to produce when the firm is covering its variable costs but not all of its fixed costs is similar to the decision to ignore sunk costs. So here, if the firm is not covering all of its fixed costs, then essentially they're at a point where they are just not working at the optimal level that they need to be working at, and so the decision becomes clear for them at that point. Like sometimes you just kind of just need to just accept loss and move on, essentially. All right, so putting everything together, we can now draw the short-run individual supply curve of Noel's farm, which again is representative of the individual supply curve of every perfectly competitive firm in all perfectly competitive industries. All right, so once again, here's the marginal cost curve. There's a price of $18. We looked at that earlier. We saw that it was profitable for her to operate at that level. Here's a price of $14. That's the minimum of the average total cost curve, which is the break-even price. So again, this price could be changing because over here this is demand and supply, and those could be shifting, and the equilibrium price can be dropping or going up depending on what's happening in the overall market. So at $14, she's just breaking even. It makes sense for her to continue operating. At $12, her price is above the minimum of the average variable cost, so it makes sense for her to continue operating as well, because once again, the losses would be less than if she shut down. And here is the minimum of the average variable cost curve, which is, again, the shutdown price, the price at which she should shut down in the short run. And so all prices above that minimum of the average variable cost represent prices at which she should supply. And therefore, if we look at the marginal cost curve, which again is going to dictate how much she will supply at any given price, because again, we always look at where marginal cost equals price to decide how much to produce for a perfectly competitive firm. We look at all these prices above the average variable cost, they essentially represent the amount that the firm is willing to supply at any given price. And therefore, that is going to be the short-run individual supply curve for the firm. The marginal cost curve above the minimum of the average variable cost represents the short-run individual supply curve for a firm. That's something that you should be able to identify. Anyway, I know it's a lot to kind of jam into your heads. Take some time to think it over. Spend some time thinking about this stuff. I've gone through this a lot in my life, so I know it really well. But, you know, there was a point where I didn't know it at all, and I had to sit down and just kind of stare at it and think about it for a while before I really put it all together and it became really clear to me. That's what anybody needs to do to really get this stuff down. So make sure that you do the same thing, okay? Take time to do it now. You don't want to be trying to learn this stuff over the weekend. You want to just review over the weekend. Learn this stuff the next couple of days. We'll finish off this chapter on Thursday, and then that'll be it. Have a good couple of days. I'll see you then.